This week, Israel launches a daring operation that rescues 4 hostages from Gaza.
Thank you for bringing my son to me.
But leaves more than 270 Palestinians dead, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. And ceasefire negotiations continue, with Hamas formally responding to a U.S. proposal that has Israeli support.
Some of the changes are workable, some are not.
But the humanitarian crisis deepens. UNICEF estimates 90% of Gaza's children do not have enough food, and Gaza's remaining hospitals are overwhelmed and short of critical supplies.
There isn't a humanitarian who will tell you that anything is near being acceptable.
And in northern Israel, fears of escalation after an Israeli strike kills a top Hezbollah commander in South Lebanon. The Iran-backed group launches one of its biggest strikes yet in Israel. Welcome to PBS News Weekly. I'm Nick Schifrin. There was continued fallout this week from an Israeli military operation that rescued 4 hostages, but the Gaza Health Ministry says killed hundreds of Palestinians. On Monday, Israel released new dramatic video of the raid. Police and intelligence operatives storming into a Hamas compound in the middle of Gaza in the middle of the day to rescue Israeli hostages confirmed in Hebrew, including Andrei Kozlov and Almog Meir Jan. But by then, the Israelis' cover had been blown and they had to shoot their way out. Leading to this scene in the nearby Al-Aqsa hospital. Hamas says more than 270 people died, but it did not distinguish between civilians and militants. Residents rushed away from the gunfight, dragging their children, including those with 4 legs, angry not just at Israel, but at fellow Arabs.
People in the Arab world are eating our olives and olive oil, and our children are dying in the streets. The world sold us out. My kids died in the streets. God is sufficient for me.
But in Israel, reunions 246 days later. Noah Argamani back in the arms of her father. A kiss for Almog Meir Jan.
Thank you for bringing my son to me, to us.
The Pentagon denied what it called widespread disinformation and said Israel did not use humanitarian aid trucks or the beach area that receives humanitarian aid over the U.S. military-built pier. The families of the hostages still in Hamas captivity rallied to try and pressure Israel's government to accept a ceasefire deal. The pressure on the government is also coming from within, after War Cabinet member Benny Gantz resigned on Sunday.
Regrettably, Netanyahu is preventing us from advancing toward true victory, which is the justification for the ongoing and painful cost of war.
After October 7th, what Benny Gantz and especially his close partner Gadi Eisenkot brought for Netanyahu was cover from the center.
Natan Sachs directs Brookings' Center for Middle East Policy. He says Gantz's resignation might increase public pressure, but could reduce private influence, pushing Netanyahu to make a deal.
He was a voice in favor of a hostage deal, and so in that sense it may diminish things just at the time that Washington is very heavily invested in trying to reach a deal in the short term.
But until that deal can be delivered, the war has no end in sight. About 120 Israeli hostages are still being held by Hamas. Amna Navaz spoke with the parents of Omer Nutra, an American citizen serving in the Israeli Defense Forces who was taken from southern Israel on October the 7th.
So Orna, tell us a little bit about your son. I understand he was born and raised in Long Island. He spent a gap year in Israel, deferring college back in 2020, and decided to stay and join the IDF. Tell us why.
So Omer was actually born in New York City. 1 month after 9/11 on 10/14. And on 9/11, I was working in the city. I was 9 months pregnant with him, and I remember walking over the Queensboro Bridge thinking to myself, I can't believe that this is happening. So he was born right after that, and into that climate in New York City, I remember a lot of people posting missing people, and now, he's on one of these pictures in this horrible terrorist attack. Nothing in his childhood could have prepared us for this. He had a happy childhood on Long Island, very close community. He was accepted to Binghamton University, but decided that he wanted to spend a year in Israel. We're both dual citizens of Israel and the United States. He said, you know, if I'm going to spend a year in Israel, I want to do it the way Israeli kids would do it. And he felt very strongly that he shouldn't just go back to college, that he should serve as well, that it was his duty to serve.
Ronen, as you know, we're speaking just after this raid in central Gaza that did end up freeing 4 hostages from captivity there. Wonderful news, joyful news for their families. As you also know, it was reported that the Gaza Health Ministry said over 270 Palestinians were killed in that operation. I just wonder, would you want an operation like that carried out if it meant that your son could be freed?
Well, obviously, we want our son back. And any way that can get him healthy back, we'll take it. But we also realize that throughout the 8 months, I believe only 7 people were rescued in an operation by the IDF, which means that most people will get out of there with a deal through negotiation. So we encourage all the parties to take it seriously and reach a deal, because that's the only and the safest way, both for our kids and the families, but also for the people in Gaza, to get to some sustainable arrangement that will basically bring some peace to the area. And it's up to Hamas right now, as far as we understand, to accept the deal.
Do you think it's time that the Biden administration starts to negotiate on its own to release American hostages like your son? Do you want to see them do that?
We like to see our son back. So any way possible to bring our son back is something we're going to welcome. I like to remind your viewers that on October 7, 45 Americans were murdered brutally, and 12 Americans were taken hostage. 4 came back. 8 Americans are still kept hostage. Out of them, 5 are considered living and 3 were murdered at October 7. It's something that not a lot of Americans knows.
As you know, in this negotiation, Hamas has continuously asked for a permanent ceasefire deal as part of this plan. Do you want the Netanyahu government to accept that?
We are family members. We cannot tell the government, you know, exactly what they need to do to get them out. But we expect all sides to stay at the table until they reach an agreement, whatever is needed.
Even if it means a permanent ceasefire?
Even if it needs a permanent ceasefire.
As you know, we just marked 8 months of this war since that October 7th attack. I know you have measured those months in days that you wear every day across your chest, 248. I just wonder if you can help us understand what the last 8 months have been like for you, watching all of this unfold, knowing the dozens and dozens, over 1,100 Israelis that were killed on that day, seeing the tens of thousands of Palestinians that have been killed since, and you just wanting your son home. What's that been like for you?
It's been a crazy roller coaster. You know, you mentioned before that the administration may be negotiating on behalf of the 8 Americans. We woke up this morning to a phone bombarded with messages. Is this true? What's happening? Is Omer coming home? You know, it's hard not to get excited by every proposition of a deal that may be happening, but then again, we've seen these deals collapse just as quickly as they surface, and it's been very difficult. And for us specifically, we don't have proof of life from Omer beyond the initial attack and video footage that Hamas themselves put out on that day showing that he was taken, and he was alive when he was taken. Our life has completely changed. We have not worked since October 7th. We're stuck with our last conversation with our son. I still have him in my head, you know, anticipating a quiet weekend.
That was the last conversation.
That's the last conversation, the evening before.
Ronen and Orna Nutra, I can't thank you enough for being here, for sharing Omer's story with us, and we hope he's back with you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
This week, Hamas replied to the latest ceasefire proposal asking for amendments, including a timeline for a permanent ceasefire and full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. The deal, as written, only guarantees that Israel will commit to a temporary ceasefire. Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressed frustration with Hamas.
You know, at some point in a negotiation, and this has gone back and forth for a long time, you have to question whether they're proceeding in good faith or not.
Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza worsens. Limits on aid delivery have largely left Gazans on their own. Her stage is Gaza's ruins, and her audience is Gaza's displaced children.
I lost all my memories, all my childhood toys in my home, so I borrowed my father's friend's guitar to continue to deliver my message to the world.
Before the war, 19-year-old Rahaf Nasser was studying medicine. Now she tries to heal with music.
Our children love to live, love to be alive, to play with each other. Here we cannot do anything of that. They cannot do anything of that. They just want peace.
There is no time to waste, given the hell that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are enduring every single day.
Today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed a conference designed to surge aid to Gaza. Martin Griffiths is the UN's humanitarian coordinator.
There was a unanimous horror at the vast toll of death, injury, destruction, displacement, serial displacement, trauma and deprivation suffered by the people of Gaza in just 9 months.
And the most vulnerable are Gaza's youngest. At this makeshift school in central Gaza, they learn to live. But in southern Gaza, UNICEF says nearly 3,000 are at risk of dying, and across Gaza, 90% lack enough food. Israel has opened the southern crossing Kerem Shalom, and hundreds of Israeli-sponsored trucks are entering. But U.S. and Israeli officials say distribution inside Gaza is limited because there aren't enough trucks, and the Rafah crossing remains closed with aid trucks backed up in Egypt. And so at already overwhelmed hospitals, there's a shortage of generators and fuel to provide power and supplies to save the sick. To discuss the medical crisis and overall humanitarian situation in Gaza, I spoke to Avril Benoit, Chief Executive Officer of Doctors Without Borders USA. After this past Saturday's rescue of 4 Israeli hostages that Hamas says killed more than 270 people, about 700 patients arrived in the Al-Aqsa hospital where you have staff. Your team was working there. Who did they treat and what were their injuries?
The injuries were horrific. At Al-Aqsa Hospital, there were 420 severely wounded that came in. Dismemberments, severe trauma. You had a lot of open fractures, shrapnel wounds, as you would expect. A lot of burn injuries, a lot arriving who were already dead, wrapped in blankets. In plastic, 190 in that one day alone were brought to the hospital and confirmed as dead on arrival.
You have some 400 Palestinian and expat doctors, nurses, and staff in Gaza. Are they able at this point to deliver the health care that they want?
No, certainly not. And there isn't a humanitarian who will tell you that anything is near being acceptable. And when we think back to the orders from the International Court of Justice back in January, imploring and insisting that Israel make sure that humanitarian aid could reach people in order to prevent conditions of genocide, we have not really seen an improvement, and at various times, such as since the beginning of June, a deterioration.
Hundreds of trucks are getting in to southern Gaza via Kerem Shalom, as well as into northern Gaza, half of which are facilitated by Israel itself. And what U.S. officials and Israeli officials I talked to say is that the big problem is the lack of trucks that can actually distribute all of that aid inside of Gaza. Is that something that you are specifically seeing, that some of this aid is arriving to the edge of Gaza, but not able to be distributed inside?
Without a doubt, you've got the shortage of fuel, which is a serious impediment for even the truck drivers that are willing to take the risks of going through so many volatile checkpoints where anything can happen. sometimes the violence is unpredictable, and where there is a lack of respect for the delivery of humanitarian aid, the indiscriminate violence, the targeted violence against humanitarians, it makes for really difficult conditions, and it doesn't help to be blamed then by the Israeli propaganda saying, well, look, the humanitarians aren't even doing their job. Well, ultimately, all the belligerents are responsible for creating conditions that would allow humanitarian aid to come in accordance with humanitarian law. And that's just not what we're seeing.
When you refer to belligerents, are you speaking about the Israelis, Hamas, or both?
Well, you're speaking of both.
Israeli and U.S. officials consistently say that they see Hamas fighters operating from UN schools, even the hospitals that we've been talking about. Have you seen Hamas fighters use these hospitals as any kind of command and control or the source of fire at Israeli forces?
We keep hearing these allegations without much to substantiate them in terms of our own experience of the hospitals where we're supporting. These are sometimes vast structures. They do have tunnels underneath for clinicians, for healthcare workers who are dealing with hundreds of patients. What we see are just hospitals that are full of patients. And a reminder to all those who justify these massacres, these attacks on civilian infrastructures on the basis of the space was militarized. Civilian spaces are being militarized by all sides in this, both sides in this. And it's not acceptable to then suggest that the protection of civilians, which is enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, doesn't apply because you might have something going on in the vicinity that is not under the control of those who are running the hospitals, for example.
Avril Benoit, Chief Executive Officer of Doctors Without Borders USA, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
In northern Israel this week, in response to an Israeli strike that killed a senior Hezbollah commander in Lebanon, Hezbollah launched one of its largest strikes into Israel yet. Some 60,000 Israelis have been displaced since the October 7th attacks from northern Israel. And to get a sense of the region, we visited Kiryat Shimona and found people on edge. In northern Israel, panic and fear. Israelis celebrating a Jewish holiday run for cover as Israeli air defense intercept Hezbollah rockets. Across the region, there is constant anxiety for a threat that empties celebrations and also cities. This is Kiryat Shimona, the biggest town in Israel's north, former population 24,000, today all but deserted. Malls once bustling, now empty. Much of the city is frozen in time. Supermarkets closed. Playgrounds silent. Roads and buildings pierced by rockets fired from Lebanon just 1 mile up the road. And so the city's staff who remain are under threat and often underground. Mayor Avichai Stern holds his meetings in a bomb shelter. He takes a rare trip upstairs to his office in a city where he was born and raised.
In 2015, Hezbollah published a video on how it will conquer the Galilee, the same scenario as we saw in October in the south. I do not underestimate them. They can cause much larger damage than Hamas. It's always better if we're the first to attack.
That call to go on the offense is shared by some senior members of the military. A response to 8 months of thousands of Hezbollah rockets, missiles, and armed drones fired into Israel. Today, Israel identified more than 200 launches. That Hezbollah called a response to Israel's killing a senior Hezbollah commander yesterday in Lebanon. Since October the 7th, nearly 300 Hezbollah fighters and more than 80 Lebanese civilians have been killed, as have 20 Israeli soldiers and a dozen Israeli civilians. Since October the 7th, Kiryat Shimona has been directly hit more than 200 times. And that's ignited wildfires. Shrapnel from rockets and air defense missiles land on abandoned backyards, creating infernos. In Kiryat Shimona and across the north, 90,000 acres have burned. Mayor Stern admits many residents won't ever come back.
Unfortunately, 40% of the people in my city said she didn't come back to the city after the war.
Tal Uziel Carmel is the mayor's assistant and a city engineer.
So how do you know when to go to the shelter?
If we hear like a really loud boom, we just run.
Last week in Kiryat Shimona, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised that Hezbollah would be punished.
Whoever thinks that they can harm us and we will sit idly by is making a big mistake.
But he didn't meet Mayor Stern, who's frustrated with what he calls government neglect.
If they really want to assist the area and the people that live here, then it's expected that they would come here and listen to our hardships, go to the hotels and listen to the evacuees. I think that's what someone who really wanted to help would do, and not just come here for the photo opportunity.
Kiryat Shimona's evacuees live in 300 hotels across the country, with 5,000 of the displaced in Tel Aviv.
This is Eve.
3-month-old Eve's family is from Kiryat Shimona, but she's never been there, and her first home is a hotel. They're all making the best of a situation that no one expected would last this long.
I want to come to home, all the family, friends, neighbor, all my life.
Matan coordinates Kiryat Shimona and all evacuees living in Tel Aviv. He used to live in Detroit.
There's no vision. No one knows when we're going back. The uncertainty is the main challenge. Is when, where, how long? Is it a month from now? Is it a year from now? Is it 2 years from now?
There is no hope, and they are not knowing when and how they will get back.
Moshe Davidovitz heads the regional council of Mate Asher, with 17,000 residents from dozens of villages. He says the map of northern Israel has already been redrawn.
Hezbollah is the owner now of our villages. This is a dead zone. There is no culture, there is no agriculture, there is no tourism, there is no salary, there is no nothing.
That anger comes from a sense of insecurity. Ishai Efroni is the council's security chief, constantly reminded of Hamas's hostages. In the control room, he can monitor regional threats, including in his own evacuated kibbutz just 150 yards from the border.
Look at the streets. Totally empty. You don't see anyone walking here. Look, all empty. No cars, nothing.
He too predicts war, but would prefer a diplomatic agreement. And he wants to preserve and protect this place so residents can return.
That's what we need from the government, to do something, to tell us when we're going to be back, and to give the army to protect us, and to make the people believe and feel safe again to go back home.
Last week, Netanyahu sent senior officials to try and provide Davidovich reassurance, but he still demands a plan for when people can return, and he remains angry and worried that any Israeli action to make this area safe could lead to escalation and a hot, dangerous summer. Finally, the war in Gaza has evoked strong emotions here at home. As part of her ongoing reporting series, America at a Crossroads, Judy Woodruff spoke with Americans on different sides to discuss how the war has affected them and how they view the U.S. response.
Some on both expressed disappointment for different reasons with the U.S. response, with clear anger and resentment toward President Biden.
He visited Israel in a time of war. He said, his words, not mine, his commitment to Israel is ironclad. And I don't think it is now. He seems to be giving in to a small but loud minority, and he seems to be putting politics before morality. He has put pressure on Israel, immense pressure, and that has slowed the war effort, and that has cost both Israeli and Palestinian lives.
Like, what of a failure of an administration? I door knocked for Biden when he was running against Trump. And I feel all these communities have been thrown under the bus. To watch millions of people being starved and say nothing, and to continuously say, I have a red line, and stand back while Israel commits a genocide and do nothing. I mean, what is the message here?
There are a few sympathetic to Biden.
I'm very supportive of what President Biden has done. I think he cares for Israel to his core. I think he deeply respects Israel. I think the pressure that he is putting on Israel is designed for the benefit of Israel and the Palestinians. And I think it is only through pressure from the United States on both sides that we're going to come to a resolution.
But the idea of reconciliation is still hard for some.
I'm not minimizing the importance of long-term discussion and bridging gaps, and patience, tolerance. But there is another part of me in which just says, okay, this is great, but here we go again. This isn't our first rodeo as the Jewish people. We have hostages, we have 19-year-old, 20-year-old soldiers being killed, we have generational trauma.
Even so, there were glimmers of guarded hope.
I believe in the two-state solution. I believe very strongly this has been the United States policy, but the solution has to be equitable and amicable, and also agreed upon by both the parties, which has never happened before. You know, peace can never be sustained if it is not equitable.
Our hearts are big enough to have compassion for our own people and for Palestinian people, innocent Palestinian, those who are innocent Palestinian people. And it's not that our hearts that can be big enough, but they must be big enough. My Jewish values tell me that everyone, every human being on this planet is created in the image of God. And we are not going to get to a solution by killing tens of thousands of people in Gaza.
There is no mistaking the pain felt on both sides. We were grateful to each panelist for agreeing to sit down with us and look forward to the time when they'll all sit together. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Judy Woodruff in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
And that's it for this week's episode of PBS News Weekly. For all of us, thanks so much for watching.